Hey everybody, it's Brian again. I hope you had a great week since we spoke last week about atheism and beginning to craft arguments. This week, we're going to dive more into specifics. And we're going to tackle first what I think is a fun but a little tricky problem that exists sometimes in our faith. And this is the relationship between science and religion. So very quickly, give me a show of hands. How many of you think or have heard of or are convinced that there is a conflict or a potential conflict between science and faith? Again, show of hands. Okay, once again, it's a video, I know, so I can't see who raised their hands. Angie, please remember to text me and let me know who raised their hands so I know how well I'm doing here. Let's talk about this relationship between science and faith. It is easy for some people to potentially argue that science really disproves faith. Science is measuring and observing and studying the natural world, and there isn't really much room for God, and science has come along and disproved the existence of God. It might also be an important question for you to consider: can I believe in God and also rely upon science? Can I hold both things at the same time? I want to tackle those questions pretty succinctly and pretty quickly, all right? So that question number one, does science disprove the existence of God? Nope, it does not. In fact, it doesn't even really try to. What does science do? Science observes and measures the natural world around us. If it can't measure and observe something, it's not that it isn't real. It's simply that it isn't the purview of science. So because science can't observe and measure God, does that mean that God doesn't exist? Nope, absolutely not. In fact, science can't measure and observe a lot of things that we definitely think are true. Let's look at a couple of really important examples. How about math? Science can't observe or measure math. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, hang on, Brian, what about like rulers and numbers? Those are not math. Rulers are rulers and numbers are numbers, and they're representations of math. But math is a concept that can't be observed, measured, seen, all those things. Here's another fun one. How about feelings? Again, by a show of hands. Who's ever been angry, sad, happy, overjoyed? I'm all for right now. But science can't observe or measure those things at all. But they're definitely true. So to recap there, the job of science, its role, its goal, is to observe and measure the universe around us, the natural world. It has no purview in places outside of that, and it definitely doesn't disprove the existence of God. Science really doesn't disprove very much at all, if anything. The second question, can I have faith in God and rely on what science teaches at the same time? Absolutely. You can believe, for instance, in the theory of evolution. The Catholic Church says it in no way opposes our Catholic faith. Or how about the Big Bang Theory? Yep, the Catholic Church says this sounds great and is a pretty accurate description of what's happening in the universe and in no way contradicts our Catholic faith. You can definitely believe in God and what science teaches at the same time without having a contradiction. Awesome. Well, that was a fun video. See everybody later. I'm just kidding. I have so many more things to say about this. But what we really need to do to understand why there's at least this perceived conflict between science and our faith is to go back in history a little bit. Because if we understand the origins of this conflict or potential conflict, we'll better be able to have conversations with our friends and family about this relationship and about how science plays into our faith and our faith plays into our understanding of science. So like I said, let's go back in time and think a little bit about water. And when I say back in time, I mean like 15,000 years ago. Imagine you're a human that lived 15,000 years ago and you see the water. Sometimes water is big waves. Sometimes it's really high up and flood stuff. Scary water. Other times it's really calm and you can paddle your boat out and go fishing and you're like, oh, happy water. Why does water sometimes seem angry and other times seems happy and calm? Well, I don't know. It's 15,000 years ago. So I guess maybe there's a water god, and when he's angry, there's floods. And when he's not angry, things are great, and I go fishing. Cool explanation for what's going on with the water. But then all of a sudden, science happens. And they're like, no, it's not a water god. There's the moon and the sun, and they do something called gravity. I don't really understand what that's about, but it causes high tides and low tides and all of these things to happen with the water on the earth. Oh, neat. That's a cool explanation of the natural world around us. Here comes a problem, though. Did science replace religion entirely, or was there just a theory that was wrong that science has a better explanation for? Where we have the problem is when people say, well, science is here now. I guess God doesn't need to be around and religion is fake. That's not what happened. We just had a better understanding of the natural world. So to take a couple of steps back, did science disprove anything, or did it just prove something else? It proved something else. No part of that was like, boo religion. That didn't ever happen. Let's be fair, though. At the same time, but on the other side of that same coin, some Christians in the world were doing something equally unfair that we can see science doing right there. Let's also go back in time and talk about a cool guy named Charles Darwin. Who's heard of Charles Darwin? He was a scientist who lived in 19th century England, and he went on a cool boat trip down to South America. And while he was there, he was looking around and went, have you ever noticed that like some birds are different than other birds? It's a really reductive understanding of his theory of evolution. But that kind of gets to the gist. Birds are different than other birds. And he thought, animals seem to be changing over time based on the environment around them. I wonder if this has been happening for millions, if not billions of years, and species are evolving. And maybe it's happening to all species, including us. And when he published this, there were some Christians, especially non-Catholic Christians in Western Europe, especially England, and in the United States who went, no, false. If it's not in the Bible, it didn't happen. Evolution's not in the Bible. Stop attacking my religion. Whoa! And that led them to saying science equals bad. And there were all kinds of historical kerfuffles surrounding this. Now, what's happening here is we're creating culturally what we call a false dichotomy, a fake split. We have some people saying science is disproving old religions, and therefore all religions. And then we have some religious people, mostly Christians again in the US and England, saying science is attacking us, so therefore we should reject science. Oh no. So Christians are rejecting science, and some scientists are rejecting religion, and we're creating this fight that doesn't even really need to be there. And in the middle of this whole thing is the Catholic Church going, wait. I don't think this conflict even really needs to exist, and we reject the nature of this conflict. Let's dive into some examples and see how this is really a false dichotomy, a fake separation of ideas. Let's talk about the Big Bang Theory. No, not that Big Bang Theory, this Big Bang Theory, which looks far more entertaining, doesn't it? The Big Bang Theory essentially says you can observe that the entire universe is moving apart from itself. Things in the universe are getting farther and farther apart from other things in the universe every single day. Well, so simple logic tells us that if tomorrow things in the universe will be farther apart from each other than they are today, then yesterday they were closer together. And the day before that, closer still. And on and on and on and on, until maybe everything in the universe was so close together that the entire universe is teeny, tiny. And then at some point, all of the things in the universe were so hot that they just went boom, and everything in the universe formed and spread out and is still forming and spreading out from that initial moment of explosion, that Big Bang. Just like earlier, really, really simplistic understanding of the Big Bang Theory, which is really complicated and has way too much math for Brian to really understand. Two things I want to point out about the Big Bang Theory. One, the cool guy, Georges Lemaitre, a Dutch physicist, who developed the early Big Bang Theory. He was, while also being an astrophysicist, a Catholic priest and a student of Thomas Aquinas. Hang on to that information. His theory, after he published it, was actually rejected by the scientific community for being, quote, too Christian. Like, this relies way too much on the existence of God. We don't think this is the right way to go. That's funny when you consider the Big Bang Theory from today's perspective. Now, I said just a second ago that he was a student of St. Thomas Aquinas. Well, he was thinking about Aquinas' argument from motion that we talked about last week, both when I was talking and in your small group, about that first mover, right? That something started the motion of the entire universe. Well, think about Aquinas' argument and Lemaitre's Big Bang Theory at the same time. And that is a beautiful description of how faith and science are working together to both understand what's happening in the universe and why it's happening in the universe. Let's look at another cool example. Who's that handsome fella? That is Father Gregor Mendel. He was a German Augustinian monk, but also a really good gardener. And he liked to go outside and grow pea plants. At this point, some of you might be thinking, I've heard of this fella in my science classes. He used to take some peas that were yellow and some peas that were green and some that were smooth and some that were wrinkled and some that were constricted and some that were, all these other things. And he would cross-pollinate them and observe that there were dominant factors, genes, and submissive ones, and the dominant genes always came out on top. And so he said that this happens in all species, and he called it inheritance. And Father Mendel is now called the father of inheritance. And it is on this idea of inheritance that the theory of evolution is hinged, right? And it's this theory that helps us understand, both on the small level, why I have brown eyes and my wife has blue eyes, and so our baby Cecilia has blue eyes. But look at the odds of that happening. It's crazy, right? That's called a Punnett square. If you don't know about them, learn about them. And that leads to this idea that species change slowly, very, very slowly. And in a short amount of time, they adapt. And in a huge amount of time, they change, evolve into different species, right? But that's not divorced in any way from God's creation of the entire universe. Now you might, I'll time out because I know everyone's thinking, well, what about Genesis and Adam and Eve? We're going to talk about the Bible at greater length, I'm sure, later. But if we understand the book of Genesis for what it is in its historical context, a collection of oral traditions that attempts to explain God's role in creation, there's actually nothing in conflict with inheritance, evolution, or the Big Bang theory. In fact, most modern evolutionary biologists argue that when a new species evolves, there is one or two, those are important, one or two firsts in one place of that species that then causes the explosion of the rest of that species. So there is always a first and then a second of a new species. So if that's the case, and that's what most evolutionary biologists argue today, isn't that kind of exactly the same as the creation of Adam and Eve through the evolutionary process? God intended evolution. Awesome, right? One more example of how our faith and science are working together. Who's heard of the scientific method? Of course you have. If you've been taking science since like ever, you've learned the scientific method. Fun fact, who developed the scientific method? Yeah, it was a Catholic priest. So forever, Catholicism, Christianity, and science have worked together, played hand in hand. And so I want us to understand that working together, we don't have to have this, again, false dichotomy, fake separation of faith and science, but rather we can see science describing what is happening and faith describing why it is happening. Science is observing the natural world, measuring our universe, and showing us what is going on in creation. And our faith tells us why God created and why we're an important part of it. And now, if we understand it that way, we can see that the what, the science by itself is limiting, and faith by itself is limiting. But when you put them together, you have a beautiful understanding of our natural world and our place in it. So my final assertion, I guess, is that science and faith should be best friends in our mind. There is no real separation between the two. Be a big fan of science. Go on, be a scientist, but also retain your Catholic faith because it will drive your why toward that end goal, ultimately. I hope that was really helpful in understanding what is potentially a really sticky topic. I know Angie's going to break you out into small groups to discuss this further. I hope to see you guys again soon. Look for another video next week. Bye, everybody.